Welcome to Say It Louder, the podcast where we speak the unspeakable and encourage survivors to reclaim their voice. I'm your host, Selena Waterman-Smith. In these episodes, I'm going to be sharing my own experiences of kidnapping, sexual assault, child abuse, child sex abuse, as well as coercive control, stalking, and harassment. And if those things feel too heavy for you today, I completely understand and maybe just skip this one. I'm one of the only women in the UAE to successfully get a rape conviction against criminals in that part of the world. And it is a system that's designed to silence women. So I think it's an important conversation and something that I'm going to dive straight into today in episode 1 and take you back to that night in 2012 where I was kidnapped. Unfortunately, my memory is extremely fragmented of that night. But the first thing that I do remember strongly is being in the middle of a street somewhere in Dubai, screaming hysterically, because I knew that something terrible and traumatic had happened to me. And because I was drugged, the memories are still fragmented to this day, but I'll do my best to walk you through it. I jumped into a car that was in the street. I have no idea who was driving it. I think it was a taxi. And there was a Filipina lady in the back seat. I jumped in the front, I put my head in my lap, and I put my head down and just cried hysterically. I don't think I was capable of speaking. I was in shock. I was battered and bloodied and bruised and still under the effects of whatever narcotics they'd given me. But somehow this taxi driver eventually took me home after dropping his passenger at her destination. And I remember this Filipina lady in the back seat trying to soothe me and stroke my shoulder, and she kept saying, "It's okay, it's okay. I'm so sorry this happened to you. It happens to us Filipina ladies all the time." I remember her saying that. After they dropped me home, I went in and woke my housemate up. I was living with someone at the moment. There was someone renting a room in my villa in the Springs, and she'd become a friend of mine. So I woke her up and I said, "I think I've been raped, and we need to go to the police station." And I still had so little bodily and mental function. And she later told me that I looked terrible. She said I was completely white, I had visible injuries, I was shaking, I was clearly in shock. And of course, when something like that happens to you, and when you're in shock, and you know that you've been sexually assaulted, you know that a crime has been committed, your first instinct is to go to the police. And I had no idea that in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, you do not go to the police and report sexual assault. You do not go to the police and report domestic abuse. You do not go to the police and report anything that a man has done to you. But I didn't know that. So we took a taxi to Jebel Ali police station, and nothing could have prepared me for the treatment that I then received at the hands of those Arabic policemen. And probably because I was still drugged and I wasn't 100% aware of what was happening around me, I was saved from some of the horrific things that they did. First of all, they brought a group of men into the waiting room to talk to me, where they all began laughing. And they asked me to draw pictures of my underwear, which I thought was really strange. Why would I draw pictures of my underwear? Why are you not taking a statement? Why are you not investigating this crime? And I began to draw on a piece of paper the bra that I was wearing. And they took this picture that I had drawn and started showing it to other people in the police station. And they all stood around and laughed. And I didn't understand what was going on, but I was very pliant and I was going along with what they were asking me to do because they were the police and they're in the position of authority. And then one of the policemen turned to me and said, "You white girls, you all come here and cry rape, and you expect us to do something about it," which was just horrifying to hear that a man in the judicial system, in the police that are supposed to protect us, would actually say that to me. And again, I don't think it completely resonated because I was still under the influence of these drugs. And then they continued laughing and joking amongst themselves. And I was shifting in the chair that I was sitting in because I had internal bleeding from injuries. And the man started shouting at me, How dare you disrespect the UAE? If you want to come in here and make a report, you need to sit properly in that chair. If you're going to disrespect us, you can get out. And again, I'm completely astonished and I'm in shock from what's happened to me, and I'm getting no empathy or no care from these men, but it still didn't register until I turned to my housemate and I just saw tears pouring down her face. And she said, she's been raped. And you're not listening to her. She's been raped. So she understood then the lack of humanity that existed in that room. The police didn't help us. They absolutely categorically refused to help and instead sent us to Rashid Hospital, which is the government hospital in Healthcare City in Dubai, where they said I needed to get a medical report. I thought the police experience was bad enough, but when we arrived at Rashid Hospital and we tried to check in at the reception and explain to them what had happened, the hospital refused to treat me. And I don't know if this is some sort of government directive that rape victims are turned away from both the police and the hospital, but they absolutely would not check me in, they wouldn't allow me to see a doctor, and they wouldn't treat me in any way, shape or form. And bear in mind, I had visible injuries, I was visibly bleeding, I was clearly in a state of extreme shock. And the security guard actually told us that we couldn't wait in the reception area, we had to go outside. And by this point, it was becoming hot outside. It was Dubai summer, it was baking hot, I'd had no water, I was injured, and they were actually telling us to wait outside in the sun. They didn't even want us in the hospital building. We refused. And I ended up lying on the floor in the waiting room. I think some periods I was in and out of consciousness. And still, nobody came. None of the nurses, none of the doctors. We must have been there for about 6 hours before they got fed up of us. And they said that if we didn't leave, they would have to call the police, which was fine. By this point, we just wanted somebody to listen. So they actually sent us to a different part of the hospital where they had a sort of security office. And they did actually have a police officer who, I guess his job was to be stationed in the hospital. Really, they just wanted us out of the way. They wanted us away from the front entrance where maybe somebody could have seen us or somebody Western or somebody could have taken over. So when they took us to this other part of the hospital where there was a police officer, we again tried to explain to him that we were trying to make a statement about a sexual assault. I knew that I'd been sexually assaulted. Even with my fragmented memory, I remembered the horrific things that had happened to me the night before. And the police officer wouldn't take any action, pretended that he didn't speak English, was pointing to the floor as if to say, you need to go and lie there, and wouldn't take any action. And I think at that point, my housemate at the time, the stress and the trauma must have been telling on her as well. And she completely lost it and actually just started screaming at the top of her voice. I don't even recall what she was screaming. But I think just the horror of being in that environment and being denied care in a country that claims to be so westernized and claims to really care about women and is such a safe space, after already being traumatized by the night before, it was so difficult to comprehend. And this is the thing about Dubai. Sometimes you have to make a real fuss and become a real problem for someone before they actually take any action. And because we'd become a problem, and because my housemate had started shouting, they did eventually call CID officers who came to the hotel and picked us up. Now, my experiences of CID are completely opposite to my experiences of Dubai police. CID stands for Central Intelligence Division, and they're predominantly Emirati. They're usually educated, they've been educated in Western countries, and they're on a slightly different level to Dubai police. So when they picked us up, there was a completely different attitude towards us. There was no racist comments, there were no nasty comments to me. But I could tell at the same time they were a bit perplexed and they maybe didn't know how to deal with a situation like this. And the first question they asked me is, what's happened? Has somebody hit you? And I said, no, I've been raped. And I could tell they didn't understand. And I don't know if they have a word for rape in Arabic. I don't think they knew what the word meant. But regardless, they took me to a rape clinic. And I didn't know they even have rape clinics in Dubai, but it was completely deserted. It obviously wasn't used very often. There was nobody in there. The lights were off. They had to hastily call a female doctor who came out, and she walked me through this laboratory and was hastily turning on all the lights. And she was the lady who gave me some type of exam. I wasn't given a rape kit because I don't think they exist in the UAE, but she examined me physically, and she had this chart, and she made a note of all of the different injuries that were across my body, including the internal injuries, which were quite severe. At this point, I hadn't had any food or water for about 24 hours. It was becoming nighttime again. I was still under the influence of whatever drugs they'd given me. I was just being led around. I was in shock. I can't even describe how horrendous that was to go through it. And after this examination in the rape laboratory, they then took me to Al Rashidiyah police station, which is a predominantly CID police station. And I must have lost consciousness at some point. I think I was in an office and I fell asleep or just lost consciousness on a sofa. And I woke up and somebody had covered me with something, maybe a blanket. And when I woke up, the first thing I saw was a huge line of men in dish dashes, which is traditional Arabic Emirati dress. They were all in a line in the corridor, and the chief of police was saying, I want to get these guys. I want every man working on this. I want every single person in this division. I want these men found. I want it dealt with. Which is crazy because after our previous experiences of the police refusing to investigate and sending me away and sending me to a hospital that they knew wouldn't treat me, suddenly we must have somehow got hold of the attention of someone in CID, and I have no idea why that CID officer chose to take action, because typically in the UAE, rape victims are immediately arrested. That part of the world does not want to acknowledge that rape happens, and maybe morally they don't think that rape is a crime. So in all the previous cases of women that have gone through these experiences, as soon as they report it, they are arrested, they are detained, and they are charged with sex outside of marriage. Because even if you were a rape victim, in the eyes of the law in that part of the world, you have still technically had sex. Therefore, you are culpable and guilty of having sex outside of marriage. And maybe these are tactics to encourage people to drop their claim and to silence victims and to make sure that people just leave the country. And then the culprits stay safe and they're never held to account for what they've done. So in my case, it was extremely fortunate that somebody senior decided to take an interest in this case, and they sent all these CID officers out to look for these men. To be fair to the CID, my experiences with them was completely different to the police. And although I don't think they have the necessary training or resources to deal with these types of cases in that part of the world, they were much kinder to me and much more empathetic than the police at Jebel Ali police station. So after I'd made my statement and after they sent the police out to look for these men, they drove me home and they asked me a few questions about what I did for work. I said I'm a business owner. I've been running my own event company in the UAE for many years. I have my own villa in the Springs. So I think these questions were to sound me out, to check what sort of person I was, to maybe see if I was credible as a witness and as a victim, which is understandable. And when they dropped me home, I was able to decompress slightly and think about what had actually happened. Because sometimes as a victim, especially a victim who's been drugged, you don't necessarily remember all of the details, but you don't need to know that on a deeply instinctive level, something horrific and traumatic has happened to you. And for context, the night before, I wasn't out on a night out, even though if I was, that doesn't matter. Women are allowed to go out and drink alcohol. But I met a friend for a drink who ended up being quite inebriated. So I ended up taking him home. And when we got back to his house, it turns out that he didn't have keys to get in. So his sister had keys, and his sister was at a bar somewhere else in a different part of Dubai. So I offered to go to this bar and meet his sister and get keys and bring them back, because obviously I wasn't out drinking. So when I got to the bar, I was messaging her on my BlackBerry, because it was 2012 when we all had BlackBerries, and she wasn't responding to my messages. So I thought, no problem, I'll just buy a drink at the bar and wait for her. And again, as a 30-something-year-old woman at the time who's traveled all over the world and engaged in solo travel, and who lives in Dubai, which is a safe space for women, it never occurred to me that buying a drink at the bar by myself would put me at risk. And that's the thing about danger. It doesn't always come knocking. Sometimes it creeps up on you when you least expect it. And at some point during the night, while drinking this drink, I started to feel very strange. And I do remember trying to leave the bar. My primary thought was getting to safety. And I remember somebody trying to make me leave with him, and I said, no, absolutely not, pushing them away from me and trying to get in a taxi. Then I have a huge blank in my memory for around 4 hours. But what I do remember is being in a room with a group of men, I have no idea how many, and essentially being raped and being brutalized in horrific ways. I remember flashes of light in my face, which I later found out was because they were filming me and taking photos. I remember being choked. I remember being hit. I remember being pinned down by multiple men and screaming and crying and trying to escape. But because of whatever drugs they'd given me, I was completely incapacitated. And I remember them taunting me and saying, oh, you want to leave, you want to leave. But I couldn't even figure out how to get out of the room. I couldn't figure out what a door handle was. I couldn't figure out how I needed to move my body. And that's what's so terrifying now, even looking back on it, is the complete helplessness that I was in as a victim. The helplessness and the vulnerability, because you always want to think that if you're in that situation, you would fight back or you would find a way to escape. But when you've been drugged, there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. So after having those memories, at some point, either I escaped or they let me go. And then my next clearer memory is bursting out into the street and just running up to a car and yanking open the door and getting in and being in hysterics. So that's how easy it is for women to be at risk of something terrible happening. And there's so much more that happened in this case. There's so much more context that I didn't find out for months later. So when I went home from the police station, I was ruminating on this and trying to figure out if I had any more memories. And the next day, the police came to pick me up and they began their investigation. So they wanted to take me around to various places in Dubai to see if I recognized the street, to see if I could recognize the apartment that I was taken to. And what was most difficult was that I was on my own dealing with this, because only 3 weeks before I'd come back into Dubai after being at my dad's funeral. My dad had died in England just recently. And my mother had also died when I was 3. So I didn't have any family around me or anyone supporting me. And these types of crimes anywhere in the world are taboo. And I'd never experienced that level of it being taboo or anything like victim blame. So when I thought the nightmare was maybe going to be resolved because of the police investigation, it actually was about to get 1,000,000 times worse, because people that I trusted would avoid me, friends that I cared about would ditch me, people would abandon me, and I had to essentially go through this horrific experience all by myself. So I think that's all we've got time for today. And in the next episode, I'm going to talk to you about how the Dubai justice system does not play fair. And while I thought that I was safe because the investigation was moving forwards, I actually did end up being punished for being a kidnap and gang rape victim. And if this podcast was useful to you, if it helped you in any way, if you're recovering from your own trauma, you can subscribe below, or you can register with the link below, and I'll send you emails directly to your inbox notifying you of when the next episode is coming up. I'll be releasing an episode every week, and I'll also be sharing healing resources and tips and bonus chapters from my book, Made of Fire, because I would really hope that my experiences can help other women and other victims, not just to heal, but to reclaim their voice, and hopefully to say it louder.